It's week 18 of 2018. We have some Ubuntu news, some Microsoft news, a lot of security news, and we've also got a success story from one of our past interviews on this show that we'll talk about. That's all coming up on the Technado, starting right now. Hello and welcome to the Technado. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, and I am joined, as always, by Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing?
I am doing swell. We got an exciting week of news. Sometimes not a whole lot happens. This week there's actually quite a bit going on, so some fun articles for us to talk about.
Yeah, and it's really spread out, too. We've got stuff from Microsoft, Apple, Linux, Facebook, the whole gamut.
You'd almost think it was a conference week, right? Like when there's some kind of convention, you always get a bunch of news out of it. No convention to speak of. Well, there was a mobile convention.
The Mobile World Congress? Was that this week?
I don't know. There was one because I did see some mobile news, but it was nothing significant enough to talk about. Like some phone has edge-to-edge screen. Who cares?
Ooh,
yeah,
wow.
no.
Is it curved?
It's getting kind of old.
Yeah.
Curved screens piss me off.
I know. That's why I mentioned it. I know your triggers.
We need safe words. Curved edges.
All right. Well, the first story we want to get to this week, I assume, is about robotics because there's a Bionic Beaver that was released, and this article is on it's on fridge.ubuntu.com. So maybe it's not about robotics. So Don, what's this about?
So it's hard to talk about this with a straight face. And Peter tries to be the common man for us, right? The average Joe when it comes to IT technology, and he relies on me sometimes to present articles that he might have otherwise missed, right? And so when I tell him, oh, we need to talk about Bionic Beaver today, it's hard to convince him this is a real article. This is something we need to talk about. But Ubuntu 18.04 was released this week. That is a big deal because even numbered releases like this are LTS releases. They're long-term support. So if you're using Ubuntu commercially, like in your business or enterprise or whatever, the LTS versions are the ones you want to run. You'll generally skip the odd numbered ones. So the 17.04, 17.10, you skip over, you get to 18.04, there's an LTS. So the last one was 16.04. The one before that was 14.04. It's almost like there's a pattern here. This one just happens to be called Bionic Beaver. That's the code name for it. I'm not entirely sure why they picked that name, and it is incredibly dumb, but the point is that it is an important release for us. Most of you probably have picked up that I'm not the biggest fan of Ubuntu, but I do acknowledge that it's one of the most popular Linux distributions that are out there. It is fairly stable, canonical. The company behind it puts a lot of investment into making it a great product. A few versions back, they made the decision to switch to the Unity user interface. And it was pretty controversial at the time. There were people like me who refused to use the Unity interface, and that's one of the reasons why I moved away from Ubuntu entirely. They acknowledged that didn't work out so well, and they announced last year they were going to be switching back to the GNOME interface, which they did in 17.10, so that's not really news. But this is the first LTS release to feature the GNOME user interface again, the window manager. So when you go to log into a clean install of Ubuntu 18.04, Unity is still available, but it's not the default UI anymore. Now you'll get dumped right into GNOME, just like pretty much every other Linux distro out there. So you get a nice stable UI that provides all the functionality that we normally expect in a desktop. We lose the resizability for if we install Ubuntu on our mobile phone, but the reality is only 10 people did that. So most of us aren't affected there, and we get the nice UI. So that's a pretty big release. If you're a business or a company that's been using Ubuntu in your organization, or even a home user, and you just didn't like Unity, well, it was always frustrating before to have to go in and turn Unity off and put on GNOME, and now you're somewhat not the typical deployment model for Ubuntu. Your support's a little bit iffy, and you could always do one of the Ubuntu variants and deploy it that way, but now you're even further off of the normal support track. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So that's really the biggest feature with this release, the fact that it's long-term support and they went back to GNOME. There's other things baked into it that make it an important release. A lot of OpenStack updates were pushed into it. It is updating to the Linux kernel 4.15, so that's a bump there. 4.15 we talked about back, I feel like it was back in December when we talked about 4.15, but it's got better support for some virtualization platforms. Their integrations are built into the kernel now, and a few other things that are tacked in that help for Docker support and containers, which are all big buzzwords. I think I've hit each of the big buzzwords in this article so far. What am I leaving out? Cloud?
Oh, you
haven't
said cloud.
but
Now,
yeah, now I mentioned it.
now the balloons will drop from the sky.
Can't really think of a cloud feature that came out in it. Well, I said OpenStack, and
You did.
OpenStack
That's
can be
true.
used to manage your cloud. So
Yeah.
there, we'll bridge that gap one way or another. But anyhow, it is out. If you're an Ubuntu fan, check it out. If you're not an Ubuntu fan, it might be time to revisit and jump back now that they've fully adopted a sane and normal window manager. You can jump in there. And there's probably several of you out there laughing the whole time because you don't care about Unity or GNOME. You run Cinnamon or Mate or XFCE or whatever it is that you want to run. All of those have been updated to 18.04 as well. So check it out.
And I'd like to shed some light for you, Don, on the naming structure.
Oh, did you find
I
the...
did, and I actually put it in the in our Slack if you want to bring it up. But there's a naming scheme that goes adjective, animal, and it's gone alphabetically. And we're back around now to B. So you've got things like the Breezy Badger was 5.1. The Feisty Fawn was 7.04. The Lucid Lynx 10.04. My favorite, I think, of this list, though, was the Yakety Yak, which was 16.10. So I don't see the A from this one listed here, but we've jumped back around now, and we're on Bionic Beaver.
So I knew about the alphabet.
Okay.
I was just curious why they picked Bionic Beaver, maybe because it sounded neat or something. And then they announced, they sort of dropped a hint as to what C was going to be. I'm trying to remember what it was now because it wasn't normally picking animals like this, like fawn, gibbon, a beaver, right? These are just regular animals. But for C, they were picking something that wasn't real. It was and it was like a trademarked. Now I got to think of it. It would be like
A liger?
a minion or something. Well, it started with a C.
Oh,
shoot,
yeah.
now-
Oh, it was C. I'm sorry.
Now I'm gonna have to Google and find out what it is. But they had sort of unofficially announced it. Was it Mark Shuttleworth, their CEO? I think that's his name. Had kind of let it slip that it was going to be something that started with a C.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, you can't really Google for that, can you? What
Well,
starts
they had
with
the
C?
Utopic Unicorn and the Wily Werewolf, so they're not. This wouldn't be their first foray into mythical creatures. So that's pretty exciting.
Got to branch out.
Well, while you look that up,
I know. I got to look it up. I have to know. But all right, so that was basically it out of the Ubuntu world. Now, one thing I do want to hit on is that Phoronix had a really great article that came out because one thing a lot of people were saying was, all right, under Unity they were focused on having mobile layout and all this crazy stuff and performance optimizations. They were sinking a lot of money into it. When we switch back to GNOME, isn't it going to make the system slower? So Michael Arabell over at Phoronix actually ran a huge benchmarks run-up, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing. Check out their website if you want to see it. Phoronix.com has great Linux news. But he did a benchmark comparing the previous version, so 16.04 with Unity.
doesn't it say 12.04?
And, well, he actually did several different ones all the way
okay.
back. So he did 12, 14, 16, and 18. I don't think it's really fair to go all the way
I was
back to
gonna
12
say,
and compare.
I
but
checked Windows 3.1 against Windows 10, and Windows 10 far out.
he does like the most thorough benchmark. He is super passionate about benchmarks. I'm not, but he is. And so if you ever want like just over the top benchmarks of crazy things, he's got it. But he posted some kernel benchmarks that I thought were pretty interesting because if you look, I expected to see a bit of a dip. That yes, we'd take a bit of a performance hit when we jumped into jumped from Unity back to GNOME. But if you look, it was already taking a hit in some of the additions. Like when Ubuntu 16.04 first came out, they took a huge performance hit in the Hackback benchmark. And granted, every benchmark works a little bit differently, but they had to fix that in updates to get it back. And now in Ubuntu 18.04, it's basically operating at the same. These are close enough together that I wouldn't consider that a big difference. So for people who are concerned about performance, when you switch from Unity to GNOME, it's just really going to be about the same for you. Now, you always have to take benchmarks with a grain of salt. They're testing on one particular use case that might not match yours. So he does, I don't know, probably 12 different benchmarks here. And some are certainly better than others. There are some that you do take a hit, and then others where you don't. And also, be careful when you read benchmarks because sometimes it's like golf and a lower score is better. But pretty much across the board, we're seeing better performance under Ubuntu 18. And part of that is just Ubuntu 18 itself. and part of that is also GNOME. Unity was pretty heavy-handed with the resources, so now we get a little bit of that back.
Sounds good. Well, we have another article here from Michael Arabell as well on Phoronix. Looks like Fedora Workstation 28 is a brilliant release. So just when you were, I was about to make the switch over to Ubuntu there. Now, I don't know, maybe Fedora Workstation 28.
Well, like I said, I'm not a big fan of Ubuntu. I am a fan of Red Hat and Fedora. So Fedora is what I run on my own system. Well, not this one that I'm on right now, which is running Mac OS. But normally I am running Fedora. Fedora 28 came out. Sadly, the best feature was that it came out on time, because they've had some really high visibility delays lately that have caused them to slip their schedule. They try and do a release every 6 months, and the last few have been several weeks or even over a month late on the last one. So this one came out on time. A handful of improvements to be found across it. The main improvements are that they've updated GNOME to 3.28. So some improvements there, especially if you use the cloud drive synchronization. That stuff actually works in 3.28. It used to ship with 3.26. That stuff did not work. I don't care what any article says. It didn't work for crap. And so now it does. But also, they built the VirtualBox virtual machine editions into the kernel that is compiled with Fedora by default. So if you want to run Fedora inside of VirtualBox, you don't have to worry about installing additions. It actually runs great. So for those of you who virtualize that way, it's got it. It already has the extensions for VMware and Hyper-V inside of it, and a handful of other hypervisors. Whoops. And I'm going to click on this screenshot for no reason. But anyhow, those were kind of the big updates. So not a shocking giant release, but on my side, I was just kind of glad to see it come out on time. That means there were no blocking bugs, that they're making really good progress. And if you're looking for a distribution that uses Wayland, Fedora gives you the best Wayland compatibility that's out there so far. It's been like that for years, and it continues to be that way. We'll start to see Ubuntu and other ones catching up over the course of 2018.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's switch gears now to some Apple news. This one kind of on the consumer side here from Engadget. Apple is discontinuing its airport Wi-Fi router. So, yeah, I never had one of these, but did you? I know we had some back here in the closet. Is something you've used before?
At our old building, we used the airport routers across the building. That was how we set up our mesh. And when we moved to this studio, we ditched them, because they were, if I remember right, they were 802.11n, and they didn't release an AC version. And so we wanted to go to 802.11 AC, and the airports just weren't updated. Well, over the course of a year, people started to wonder, like, hey, why isn't Apple updating these things? They're starting to get old, starting to get dated. And more time went by, and then it was announced that Apple had taken all of the employees on the airport team and shifted them over to work on other hardware projects. Most of them ended up going to the HomePod team and working there. Some of them went to the AirPod team to work on the AirPod headphones. But point is, they gutted the employees. And so that's not a good sign for a product. That means the airport routers have been kind of on life support for a little while. Well, Apple finally came out and said, we're making it official. We're discontinuing the airport Wi-Fi routers. So they are going away. And not just the airport Wi-Fi routers, they're also discontinuing the time capsules, which to me is a bigger deal, because if you wanted to do time machine backups, you could buy a time capsule, you could stick it on your network, and then just forget about the thing. And your systems would back up to it. It was a really great solution. Well, they're killing that off as well. There are third parties like Western Digital and Seagate that actually have time machine products now, NASs that are compatible with it. QNAP has low-cost NASs that have time machine built into them. And you can take any Mac and turn it into a time capsule server, really, if you want. Anything running, like Mac OS High Sierra has it built into the OS that you can turn it into a time machine server. So Apple just finally decided, hey, it's time to kill this one off. I have theories on this, because I feel like they're working towards discontinuing Mac OS. And so you don't back up an iPad or an iPhone to a time capsule. The wireless routers, that space is kind of a commodity system. So I think Apple's just kind of cutting off this as not a profit center for them, and focusing back on where they're making their money, which are iPhones and not so much iPads. Not really doing well there, but iPhones and regular desktops. So anyhow, if you're running an airport and you're wondering when the new versions are going to come out, the short answer is never. And there's plenty of other solutions that are out there.
eBay.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
you know,
there you go.
but the problem there is that if you want 802.11 AC or whatever comes next,
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
you're going to have to replace that hardware. And Google Wi-Fi, you've got Linksys Velop, you've got several different mesh network solutions that are out there that all directly replace what Airport did, and they all run the latest wireless standards. So there's plenty of options out there.
There you go. Sticking with Apple now, this one on Gadgets 360 or gadgets.ndtv.com. Apple cross-platform app feature will only launch in 2019. This is something we've talked about for a few weeks now. Not only can you run iOS apps on your MacBook, but also will we eventually see that merger between the two different OSs, which Tim Cook told us last week we would not. And he's added on now that, and we won't see this anytime soon either, because maybe they're figuring out, maybe we should do that. I don't know. That Don has said several times we should merge those two. So maybe Tim has been watching.
Well, so here's my thought, and I'm going to be a little skeptical on this. So Tim Cook said that. He said, "Hey, our users don't want us to merge the OSs, so we're not going to do it." At the same time, they were touting, "We're going to make it where you can run iOS apps on Mac OS," which I thought was really odd. My argument was Macs don't have touchscreens, and if you have no touchscreen, controlling most apps is not going to be pleasant. So it's not realistic. So they're sitting here telling us they're going to give us this feature that doesn't make sense unless they put touchscreens on the Macs, which they've repeatedly said they're not going to do. Well, we have enough conflicting statements at this point that I think the entire company is going to disappear into some spatial vortex in the next few weeks, or they got to reverse one decision somewhere. Yeah. And the easy way out of this, I mean, aside from temporal disruption, would be for them to kill off Mac OS, right? So our users don't want to merge these OSs. Okay, so we'll just kill one off. Now you don't have to merge anything.
Good
right?
point. Yeah.
We want iOS apps to run on a Mac. Okay, well, if we get rid of the Macs, then we don't need to make them run there. That's the easy solution to this problem. It's a little bit cynical, but I feel like they've done a pretty lackluster job in macOS High Sierra, just in general, and just the update, the gutting of the server app. Like they're making all the motions. And I think I mentioned this last week. Do you remember when Netflix, for a little while, they said they were going to take it where their mail order DVD system was going to be under a different name? I can't remember what the name was.
Something with a Q. Yeah.
Something crazy. And it was every sign that they were going to sell off that part of the business. Mm-hmm. Like if we give it a separate domain name and all this, it'll be so easy to sell. And customers revolted. Well, Apple is doing that. Apple is like trying to do everything they can to split these two apart. I don't know. I love Mac OS. I think it's a great operating system. It runs on top of BSD Unix. It's probably one of the most user-friendly Unixes that are available. It'd be a shame to see it go, but man, Apple, could they do anything more to make it look like they're killing this OS off?
Yeah. Well, what worries me too about potentially merging the two is, if you've been to your child's dance recital, you've seen all the people now holding their iPads, using that as the camera. So in a year, will people be holding MacBooks up and just if we completely merge the two? And that sounds just terrible.
Let's go a little far-fetched here. We'll go sci-fi style and see how Apple could do this. What if we painted a picture of a world here where you didn't have a laptop, you didn't have a tablet, you just had a phone, right? So maybe an iPhone.
Yeah.
And then Apple thinks different and innovates and creates Google Glasses, right? and that's your computer, right? So now you don't need a tablet, you don't need a laptop. It's all in this self-contained thing, and it's tied to your phone.
One of those virtual keyboards where you just kind of type it on the desk and it sees.
Yeah. Or if it can read your mind or your eye pointer or something, I don't know. And that would solve my dream of having like where your laptop and your phone is combined. Mm-hmm. Like if you could just have it all merged. Maybe that's what Apple's working towards. They are an innovative company lately, not so much, but they are an innovative company. They do come up with neat things. So maybe that's the plan. I don't know. It's just there's so many conflicting statements coming out of Apple right now on what they don't want to do that it's hard to figure out exactly what they do want to do. And 2018 is shaking up to be a pretty quiet year. I'm really curious to see what they do with iPhones come this August, right? When they do their big, or when's the big announcement? October?
Yeah.
So when they do the big announcement in October, what What's new and exciting there? Or are they just going to wait and say, you know what, let's put 2018 on park, and then 2019 we're really going to get out and kick some butts? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's when it's going to hit the fan. Oh, I'm excited.
It just got real.
I'm excited. It's big time. I'm looking forward to being chipped and just having my computer embedded in me. All right, next up, we'll switch to Microsoft, who was also stale. This one on The Verge. Microsoft reveals lots of new Outlook features following Gmail's redesign. We talked about the Gmail changes. A lot of we talked about the security elements of the updates to Gmail. There's some interface design changes as well, which have mixed reviews, as every new UI change seems to, until they make the next UI change and people complain that it's not like the other one. But yeah, they've made some new features in a redesign based on what we've seen from Gmail. So any of the features stand out to you, Don, as game changers?
So, there's not any like single feature here that's amazing and spectacular. Once again, they've really chosen not to integrate digitally signed emails in OWA for some reason. Yeah, that's that one feature that I keep saying everybody needs to have. Most of this stuff is just designed to make your life a little easier. Things like Office Lens, which, have you ever used Office Lens?
I've never used it, no.
So Office Lens is actually a really cool product, and it's separate, on mobile at least, where you install the Lens product, and you have a piece of paper like The Verge is showing here, and you can scan it, and then it can OCR it and turn it into an actual text document for you, or it can just embed it as an image. You can clean it up. See how it's, when it takes that picture, the picture is slightly at an angle.
Yeah.
Hang on, it'll loop again here. And it's a little bit got a shadow to it. And so it straightens out the text and it removes the shadow. Like that's what Lens does, and it makes it where this information is really presentable. That's now integrated into their mobile app. So it's just, instead of a separate product, it's built into Outlook Mobile. So that's a neat feature, I think. OWA, Outlook Web Access, got a facelift. So it looks a little more modern because the UI was getting a bit dated. Microsoft usually updates their UI about every 7 years or so. It's not a frequent thing that they do. Better than Google, though, where Gmail's had that same UI for over 10 years, and they just now went in and started to refresh it a bit. So what was neat about this really was the timing, that Google released their update, and just a week later, Microsoft gets in and says it's time for ours. I wonder, how many months was this in the works for, or did they just do all this work in 1 week? Like, whoa, crap, Google just updated. All hands on deck.
Yeah, why don't they do this every week? That would be the way to go. All right, well, let's stay with Microsoft, and this one's a little more innovative here on their end. It's on an article on ZDNet where Microsoft, or Windows 10, is basically saying, we're going to kill off passwords, and here's how we're going to do it. And I mean, they've been working at this for a while with the hello screen and images, or you swiping and drawing on your screen. So what are they combining all of those things now? Or
basically, yes. So I've made fun of a number of companies like Facebook and other ones that have come out and said, we need to get rid of passwords. We're going to move away from passwords. And every one of those companies, one, they still use passwords, right? And two, they really haven't done anything to move away from them. If anything, they've made it worse by adding dual-factor authentication and more complex passwords and so on. So none of those companies have really made any strides in getting rid of passwords, right? But Apple and Microsoft, those two companies really have. They've really done a lot of work to get away from passwords. On the Apple side, they did things like Touch ID, right? Which fingerprint scanners on computers was not a new thing, but Apple was the first one to really embrace that and build it into the OS and get that adopted. Well, Microsoft is kind of doing the same thing, but on steroids. And they're saying, look, we don't think the solution here is just fingerprints or facial scanning or retinal scanning. We think the solution is any mixture of those. And so the Windows Hello framework, it encompasses all of those different features. And when you get it configured and set up, it does replace the password. But on a lot of systems, you still have to define a password at some point. Well, with Windows Hello, they're actually evolving that to get to where you don't even have an initial password, that your initial password is your fingerprint or is your facial scan or whatever it is that you choose to make that first one. And then you combine that with things like email authentication, text message verification, and so on, and you literally don't have a password. Now, there is a password down under the scenes. You just don't see it, right? And if you ever worked in an Active Directory, every computer that's joined to your Active Directory has a password, a very long, complex one that changes very, very frequently, right? Some of them change every 6 hours, depending on how your security policy is configured. But you don't care because you never see that password. Well, that's how Microsoft is trying to get the user passwords to be, where they could change as rapidly as once an hour, but you wouldn't care because you'd never see that. It's all hidden away, and you just sit down in front of the computer and authenticate. I was talking with Mike Roderick yesterday at the end of the day. He's one of the edutainers over at ITProTV, and he was just filming content on Windows Hello, and he had a fingerprint scanner stuck on his laptop and a special camera on top of his laptop, and he would just walk up and sit down at his desk, and the desktop would unlock. Okay, well, we've had that for a year or two now. That's not news. But when you can launch Outlook and go into your email, or you can launch Skype and go into a video call and do all of that without authenticating as well, that's where the real power is, right? Getting this integrated into the operating system and integrated into the apps. And somebody like Facebook, they can't do that. Facebook doesn't control your operating system. Facebook doesn't control your apps. They don't even control your web browser. Like, there is no Facebook web browser. So it takes somebody like Microsoft or Apple or Canonical, Red Hat, somebody like that to get in and say, we're going to build this into our OS and build it into our apps. And that's exactly what Microsoft is doing. So the ZDNet has a really good write-up on this. And they link to a number of different places inside of Microsoft where they talk about the Authenticator app, FIDO2, which we've talked about with YubiKey, and other ones so that you can authenticate and not have to punch in that password. It's exciting. So from being just one of those little tech blurbs that we talk about to actually being an implementable technology, I think we're reaching the end of that cycle where now this is something you can implement. And in 2019, I think this will become a lot more commonplace.
Yeah, and for those of you that checked out our webinar from RSA, we talked about the interview that Daniel did with Unify ID, which had the application on your phone where it's actually tracking some biometric things, like even the way you walk, and using that to basically take that step out where you have to manually authenticate, but it's authenticating you based on the machine learning it's doing and figuring that stuff out. So yeah, we're really seeing some leaps and bounds in this technology. And just yesterday, I believe Twitter said they're getting rid of passwords, or specifically, you should get rid of your password that you use on Twitter, because they put those out there in plain text, or it made it. Or they were not encrypted.
Twitter's got a really interesting solution to the problem. They're like, you know what? We wouldn't need passwords if we didn't have users.
Oh,
so if we just get rid of all of our user base, then we don't have to worry about passwords, and the network is super secure. I feel bad for Twitter, and we didn't grab their article, did we?
No. I don't
okay.
think so. Yeah.
So let's talk about that briefly, because it's being misrepresented. That a lot of the announcement out of Twitter was that due to a software bug, your password may have been stored in plain text on one of our systems, and as a result, you should change your password, right? And a lot of security websites and the common news websites, places like Fox and CNN and those guys, have started reporting saying, Twitter password's breached, you need to change your password, all right? But there wasn't actually a breach.
Yeah, so they were still on their machines.
Yeah.
And encrypt on those, password protected machines.
Right. And normally when you put in a password on a site like Twitter, they encrypt it. They do a hash, right? A non-reversible hash of the password, usually like a SHA-256 hash or something like that. And then they store it in a database. Well, due to how they were handling the login information, it was actually logging to one of their logging systems prior to that hash being calculated. So your password was stored in plain text on one of their logging servers. Now, if that server had been breached, then yes, the passwords would have gotten out, and that'd be really bad. But it was one of their logging servers, right? It was internal only. Now, that means that it wasn't leaked. It was not out there on the dark web. But in theory, a Twitter employee could have potentially gained access to those passwords during the time, or a external attacker who is super sophisticated could have penetrated that system and just nobody knows, right? So Twitter is erring on the side of caution and saying there's not been a breach. We're not aware of anyone gaining access to this, but potentially for a brief period of time, your password may have been stored in plain text on one of our logs. So change your password and you don't have to worry about it. So that's what they're saying, which is I think, a pretty responsible thing to do.
It is, but it also makes me wonder if there was something like, we know an employee was looking at this, or because to take that PR black eye as opposed to just say, oops, let's fix this change and wipe out the log and start over, this is obviously a discussion they had internally of
Sure.
do we go and tell every single user to change their password or not?
Well, and if this were happening 21 days from now, when GDPR's penalties go live, if there was a breach, they would be obligated to report it within 3 days, right? But this is not a breach. This is just an internal system that stored data different than the way they were representing it to you. So I think they're just trying to say, look, if we just start announcing this stuff and getting it out there, then when a real breach happens, maybe it'll take the sting away.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I've gone ahead and changed mine from password 1 to password 2 now. So with capital P. So when I changed the A to an ampersand, so no one's getting.
See, I get really tricky, and mine's password 1, but I write out ONE, and that way, Because I mean, who would even think that? Like, you're gonna spell out a number? That's
not
ridiculous.
Me. Yeah, I've just been trying your birthday. Well, speaking of other just horrific flaws that are affecting everyone. Microsoft issues an emergency patch for a critical flaw in Windows containers. So I assume this means that all data on Microsoft machines is now compromised?
In our world is going to end, right? All your base belong to us. This one it's a bad security flaw, right? It is a flaw in the way that Windows imports images into its Windows containers that allows an attacker to basically put whatever the heck they want into an image. And when you import it, the whole thing about a container is it's supposed to have boundaries, right? It's supposed to be limited. All of your data is held in this little container. That's the name. And this flaw allows a process running in the container to escape the container and basically write anywhere on the system with full privileged write access because it's done during the importation of that container. So that's bad, right? But let's put a little bit of perspective on this one. First off, it happens during the importing of a container. So when you grab a container image and you go to deploy it, well, you should only be deploying images from trusted sources. Somebody would have to be giving you a maliciously crafted container to be able to do this. If you build your own containers, this isn't going to happen. If you're using containers from official repositories, this isn't going to happen. So this would be, hey, you went out and downloaded some container image from some website and loaded it. Well, who's doing that? Like, nobody does that. So that's not a very common thing. So that's kind of the perspective boundary, like realism number one, right? Number two, it's Windows containers. Who the hell even uses those things, right? Microsoft is trying really hard to get those things successful, but they only left beta status a few months ago. This is not something people have widely deployed in production, so it's not a very widely used feature. It relies on you downloading a malicious image. I mean, there's so many things to happen here to make this exploitable that it's pretty unlikely anybody listening to this podcast right now is affected by it. But Microsoft recognized the severity of it, and they did an emergency patch. And those are pretty rare. And this is where they say, we're not going to wait for a roll-up. We're going to roll this out immediately. So the flaw was discovered by a security researcher. They're pushing the patch out there, and there hasn't been any in the wild use of this flaw. But now that it's been announced and it's been emergency patched, you could start to see that. So it just reinforces how important it is to do your operating system updates to make sure that people can't take advantage of old flaws that you haven't patched yet. But for most people, this is not a panic, run out and patch right away, unless you happen to be using Windows containers and just freely downloading images from all over the internet.
Which I do all the time. All right.
It's your favorite pastime.
Yeah, it is. Let's switch gears now to Amazon and AWS. Amazon is no longer allowing players to front on your domain.
Why do they have to front?
Blocking domain fronting.
So a couple of weeks ago, Google announced that they were going to block domain fronting. There wasn't much news on this because it didn't really affect anybody. But now Amazon has followed suit and announced that they are putting an end to domain fronting on AWS. Now, if you're asking yourself, what is domain fronting?
I was about to ask you that.
That is a pretty good question. So basically what's happening here is there are several app vendors out there that have secure chat apps where you can chat with other people and it's encrypted end to end and nobody can see that, right? And there are many governments in the world, the US government included, where the government would like to see those chats. They would like to know what you're talking about. And in some countries, they would even like to block those chats because they don't want you starting an insurrection or staging a rebellion, a coup, whatever. So they want to be able to block those. Well, the app vendors, it behooves them to want to dodge those blocks, to be able to keep their app working and not allow a government to be able to block them, to give you end-to-end encrypted chat so you can talk to people and maintain your privacy. So they come up with creative ways to get around blocks, right? That if the U.S. government decided today that that's it, we're killing off Snapchat, and they put a block in and said, if you try and access a Snapchat domain, it's now blocked, right? They could do that. They could do it based on the domain name, and the U.S. government has that in their authority. They could go in and they could do it. Well, the people at Snapchat headquarters might just look at that and say, all right, well, we could switch to another domain. But then the U.S. government would just block that one too. And it would just be a cat and mouse game, right? Constantly blocking whatever they changed to or whatever IP address they were using and so on. Well, you can actually leverage other services out there to hide what your domain name is or hide what your IP address is by putting it behind one of theirs. So a couple of really common scenarios are using services like Cloudflare is one that you can hide behind, but Amazon has CloudFront that lets you do the same thing, where CloudFront is designed to give you a single point. You point all of your web traffic at the single point, and then CloudFront can distribute that across the globe to servers that are near you or to load balancers that are on the back end. They can hide all the complexity of your network. And it does that by using an Amazon, really it's a load balancer up at the front end that has an Amazon domain name. And so you're supposed to create a CNAME in DNS that maps like snapchat.com to whatever.cloudfront.amazon.com. Well, what if you don't use a CNAME? What if you tell your app, no, reach right out to this Amazon CloudFront domain? Well, now if a government wants to block that, they would have to block Amazon domains, or they would have to block CloudFront IPs. And when they do that, it's going to block every other service that's using that. So things like Netflix, iCloud, Dropbox, a number of big services all use AWS, or they use Google Compute Engine, or they use Microsoft Azure. So blocking those domains would result in blocking a lot of services. Now, there's some countries like in Russia where they said, tough luck, we'll do it. And they did it. They blocked the AWS domains, or not AWS, the Google ones, and it shut down a ton of services, right? It caused a lot of problems. So Amazon is basically stepping in ahead of time and saying, you know what, we're not going to allow domain fronting anymore. If we see that it's being done, it violates our terms of service, we'll end your account, which is what they're going through right now with some of the chat apps. Or they'll actually start doing active checks to see if it's being used that way and block those connections. So it's stopping that way of hiding behind another company's domain. And some people are up in arms about this. Like, hey, if I'm in a country with an oppressive government, this was a tool that let me communicate. Well, that's true, but it is taking advantage of a system that you're moving through. And so Amazon, they've got a lot of customers. They've got to keep active and up, and they've got money they have to make, right? And you can't do that when your service is blocked. So they're taking that step. Other cloud vendors have already done it. So it's not a security flaw. It's not a exploit or a breach. It's just a trick that companies were using to be able to hide where their servers were to stop governments from being able to block them. So it was like an anti-censorship tool in a way. But it would basically let them masquerade as Amazon or masquerade as Microsoft or Google and stop them from being blocked. So that's coming to an end, and a number of those services are going to break down. In Iran, they did this. They blocked them, and then they rolled out an official state-authorized chat app with end-to-end encryption. But, of course, the private keys are held by the government, which means it's end-to-end encryption, but they can decrypt it at their leisure.
The end is at the government's data farm.
So at that point, why even bother encrypting it? You might as well just go back to using AOL, and then at least you get the happy little voice that says, "You've got mail."
Yeah. Hello, welcome. Yeah. All right, well, let's stick with the security news here. So on bleepingcomputer.com, it says, starting today, Google Chrome will show warnings for non-logged SSL certificates. And what's interesting for me, and let me see if it's the same for you. Oh, it says secure for you, but on Bleeping Computer here, for me, it says my connection to the site is not fully secure. The irony. But anyway.
I'm running an ad blocker, so there's probably an ad on yours.
That would be what it is, yeah. But yeah, so I always thought you had secure, which with HTTPS, or non-secure. So what is a non-logged SSL certificate?
All right, so non-logged is actually referring to what's called a certificate transparency list, or a CT list. And if you're not familiar with those, you really, really should be. I love them. In the past, you could go to a vendor, like I could go to DigiCert, right? I like DigiCert. That's where I buy my certificates. So I go there and I could buy a certificate for any domain that I owned. So if I own Technado.com or whatever, do we own that?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, great. All right. So anyhow, so if we own something like that, then I could go and I could buy a certificate for it, right? And that would be issued to me, and there we go, right? But you, the viewer out there, you could call up some SSL provider like Thought or Global VeriSign, somebody like that, and maybe you could socially engineer them and say, no, hey, I'm done with Technado, sell me the certificate. And they would sell you the certificate. Now, I would have no idea that happened because you did that transaction on your own. I wasn't involved in it. I don't get an email receipt or anything like that. It happens, and that's that, and I have no knowledge. So a couple of years ago, somebody proposed a certificate transparency list where anytime a certificate is issued, a note that says the certificate was issued is added to this list. And the list lets you see if anybody else gets a certificate with your name. And there's plenty of companies that are out there. I'm trying to remember the name of the one I use, SSL Mate. Hang on, do I have that? Oh, I don't have it up here. I use a service, I'm pretty sure it's called SSL Mate, that monitors these certificate transparency lists for any domain that I'm attached to. And anytime a certificate is issued anywhere in the world in a domain that I work on, SSL Mate will see the certificate is issued and I get an email. And so I see that email, I'm like, ooh, did I issue that or not? And if I didn't request it, then I know that somebody else has managed to get a certificate under my domain name, right? So it gives you a great way to monitor that and tell if somebody is generating inauthentic certificates. The problem is the certificate registrars, when they issue a cert, they have to add a note to the certificate transparency services, the CTs. And if they don't add a note, we don't know about it, right? So what Google is doing in Chrome is they're saying if you go to a website and they've got an SSL certificate and it's valid, it's a valid certificate from a trusted registrar, but it's not in the CT list, then they're going to give you a warning. And it's going to say like, yeah, it's encrypted, but because it's not in the CT list, this could be a forgery. This could be a socially engineered certificate that was issued without authorization. We don't know because it's not in the CT list. And so they're going to give you a warning there. So they're already issuing warnings for when you go to non-secure websites, and they're giving warnings for situations like Peter's where you have a mixed website where some of the content's secure and some of the content isn't. This one is an entirely secure page. The whole page might be secure with a valid certificate. But if it's not in a certificate transparency list, how do we really know that it's valid, right? It just comes down to trust at that point, which is not enough. And so these certificate transparency lists are really, really cool. And if you haven't done it, if you manage a domain or have a domain you care about, check out SSL. Just do a Google search for SSL Mate. I'm pretty certain that's the name. You can sign up for a free account and you can add in your domains and it'll monitor. And anytime somebody issues a cert, they'll let you know. I've actually found a couple of instances where services that I used to use that I don't use anymore were issuing Let's Encrypt certificates for my domain. And they had just had some automated system and they were updating because Let's Encrypt certificates expire every 3 months. There was one service where I hadn't used them in 2 years and they were still issuing Let's Encrypt certificates for my domain. And so I was able to reach out to them and get them to stop it. I wouldn't have known they were doing that otherwise. And so here's a company that has these valid certificates for my domain because I authorized it a few years ago. Now I need to go back and revoke that and say, no, you guys aren't allowed to do that anymore. You got to stop issuing those. So that's what this is all about. If you're a sysadmin, you should care about CT. It's important. If you're a regular end user, it's just one more added layer of security to let you know how legitimate the certificate is for a site.
Sounds good. And just remember, there are only a couple more shopping days until Mother's Day. So if you're looking for something, a certificate for someone would be
absolutely
yeah, great.
Nothing
great
says
thing.
I love you like a 4096-bit certificate.
Yeah.
Moms love X509 certificates.
Sounds like a bumper
It's
sticker.
a Hallmark
Yeah.
slogan. We got to work out here somehow.
Yeah,
But
I think so. You're right. All right. This article next up here is from threatpost.com. Hacktivists and tech giants protest Georgia's Hackback bill. Hackback is something we've talked about a little bit on this show before. I remember specifically when we had the Plum.wine founder on the program. We were talking about in his former life. He was hacking the hackers a little bit, and we were talking about some of the ethical and legal situations with that. So something has come up, a law in Georgia that I believe is sitting on the governor's desk now, Governor Deal, that would allow companies, within certain limits, to hack back people that had hacked their networks, and hacktivists are up in arms, and I imagine other hackers that are bad people would be up in arms too.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because on one hand, if somebody's hacking my computer, if they're trying to break into one of my systems, then we're from Florida, right? We have stand your ground. We have the castle doctrine. We have all these rules that says, like, if you're trying to get in my house, I'm allowed to shoot you. So if you're breaking into my server, seems like at a minimum I should at least be able to reach out and shut off your network access or something like that. I should be able to reach back and mess with you, right? Yeah. And that makes sense. But here's where we get into the gray area, is that only the most amateur of hackers attack you from their own system. They're almost always using an intermediary, right?
My refrigerator.
The web camera that you have in your home.
Exactly, yes.
That's what I use, yeah. And so let's say that I wanted to attack Peter's laptop, right? So I could compromise, and I'm saying I could. I can't do this stuff. I'm not some advanced hacker or anything, but a talented hacker could compromise somebody's system. And maybe that system is your grandmother, right? Your neighbor, just somebody who's not an IT person at all, could compromise their system and then use that system to then attack Peter's laptop, right? Or a server, Microsoft, Facebook, whatever, use it to attack these services. So now, if they're attacking Peter and Peter says, that's it, I'm going to attack back, right? I'm going to hack back. Well, who's he hacking? Not the hacker. He's hacking the grandmother, the neighbor, the school teacher, the person who is not an IT person, whose computer was unwittingly compromised. And if he goes in and does some damage, like, oh, I know, I'll go and format their hard drive, wipe out their operating system, and shut the computer down. That'll teach them. And then the school teacher comes home, they push power on the computer, operating system not found, right? You've attacked the wrong person. So that's what Hackback allows. Hackback allows you to basically attack the wrong person. Unless it's an untalented hacker, in which case you do get the right person, then it's fine. It's all sunshine and rainbows, right? So that's what people are up in arms about is, look, Hackback is dangerous. There has to be rules. There have to be rules of engagement and so on, which the moment you put stuff like that in place, it ruins the whole thing because the hackers, they don't have rules of engagement. They don't have boundaries that they follow. They can do whatever they want because they're already breaking the law. So there's not really a way to set up a lawful response here without getting law enforcement involved. And unfortunately, getting law enforcement involved is a process that takes a series of months. Hacks are usually over in a matter of minutes. So it's so far off that there's just not a response. People feel helpless, and so they want to pass laws like these that say, we're allowed to attack back. But the damage that could happen. But I tell you, if it passes, and you're a pen testing company or any kind of security company, you'll want to open up a Georgia office that you can start doing your operations from because your legal liability will drop significantly. I mean, that will open up all new possibilities to you. Georgia could become the next booming security tech sector. This could really work out.
They're fighting to get Amazon HQ too. Atlanta's in the running, so maybe this would let them.
I mean, imagine the security services that they could offer by being based out of Georgia. I can't imagine it'll get to that point.
Maybe this is Georgia, the former Soviet. No, this is Georgia, the state. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I will say though, I think that teacher you mentioned had it coming because she didn't change the default password on her camera or whatever.
And it normally does come down to something like that. Yeah. So it's hard to be angry. But
legally, she'd be able to then hack you back because you hacked her.
Yeah, she obviously would have the skills and talent to do.
Sure.
Saying, well, we shouldn't make broad generalizations like that because no matter how good you are, like even if you're a security researcher, you can still get your system compromised. People come up with really creative stuff. So, I'm talking about the school teacher, but what if she is a doctoral fellow at a university for security or IT security? I mean, she could be the most brilliant security technician in the world, and you can still get compromised. It happens. But now you've got a third party involved.
The cycle will never end.
It gets so complex, and that's what makes this hard.
Well, speaking of companies that have either had breaches or been involved in those kinds of things before, we wanted to look at a couple of stories that talk about the fallout and the future that comes from that. So let's start with Cambridge Analytica. So they filed for bankruptcy. This is the company, obviously, that was involved with the I don't know if we want to call it data breach or
it's not a data breach.
Or the additional information that was gleaned from Facebook users and used back during the elections and for other campaigns. But they filed for bankruptcy and they're dismantling. So great, it's all done. This headline is a bit deceiving, as Don pointed out. But basically, the people behind that company are moving on and starting up a new shop.
Yeah, the headline's a little misleading because this is from the Register, and that's what they do. But basically, Cambridge Analytica is going out of business, which I honestly... I kind of feel like they just got some of the best advertising possible. Like, these guys will do whatever it takes to get you the best data possible. Yeah. Like, I feel like they're throwing that away. But anyhow, they are shuttering the doors on Cambridge Analytica. And then I think it was 3 of the owners or founders were moving over and forming a new company called Emmer Data that effectively does the same thing. So they're just Emmer Data, right? But it is a new company. The reality is they didn't break any laws or no laws that are on the books yet. So they didn't do anything illegal. They did get a ton of information, but they're too in the spotlight for what they wanted. They didn't want to be in the spotlight like this. So changing names helps to solve this. Before the show, Peter and I were talking. This is not an uncommon process. I remember when, was it Philip Morris? Philip Morris, a cigarette company, where they rebranded under the Altria brand so that people wouldn't associate every product they make with cigarettes and lung cancer. You had, I got the direction wrong, right? AirTran and ValueJet.
Yeah, ValueJet.
What are they now?
First, I thought they became AirTran, and then did they go out of business?
Oh, maybe. Well, that didn't work out for them. But companies will change names like that.
Google with Alphabet.
Yeah, well. And that, I think, is more like about tax evasion. But a lot of times they'll change their name just to keep their perception up. Here, it's not just changing the name, though. Like, they actually shut the business down and they open a new one. But the key thing is here, what negative effects did Cambridge Analytica have out of all this? They just changed their name, right? I mean, that's not really a negative effect. And we are seeing a lot of that. There were several articles this week. Facebook was really at fault with the whole Cambridge Analytica thing in that they were sharing way more information than most of us find acceptable. So they're obviously taking a big hit. Stock values are low. They're about to go out of business.
Oh, no.
No. Revenues jumped 50%. Facebook is doing great, right? Equifax, they just had a chance to reelect all their board members. They reelected every one of them, right? So these companies have like no penalty. There's no penalty for these data breaches that happen. And with Equifax, it was an actual data breach. With Facebook, it was just naivety. But there's really not a penalty here. And we could even extend this to other things. If you look at like Adobe, which had one of the most massive user breaches in history, Yahoo, who had a huge breach and hid it from the public for years. They did get a fine, but it, for a company their size and their revenues, really wasn't that significant. And they're circling the drain anyway. So these companies, there's no penalty here. If you have a data breach, you get a little bit of bad PR for a week, maybe, unless you're a really big company, in which case maybe it goes on for a month. And then after that, it's all smooth sailing. You're back in business and it's no problem. That, to me, is the real challenge that we're facing with IT security is there's just no penalty. But it's not just there. I mean, there was a housing market crash, right?
I'd heard about that.
And how many people went to jail or got in trouble for that?
It was like one, probably.
Not many,
yeah.
And Enron. Did anybody go to jail from Enron?
I think someone went to jail from Enron. But I speaking of the housing one, my realtor was just telling me that she saw the first. I can't remember what the term for it, but basically a loan where your wages and your income isn't verified. You just basically pinky swear that this is what you make, and they say, okay, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and do that. And that was one of the big types of loans going on before the bubble. So those are back now. So hold on to your shorts there. It's going to get exciting.
Hold on to your shorts.
I believe that's. Oh, by the way, AirTran was acquired by Southwest in 2011. That's why
nice.
I haven't heard of it in a while. So good for them. It all worked out. See?
Yeah. If you're flying Southwest.
I like that we're comparing breaches to crashes in the Everglades.
Yeah, and the loss of human life. But
Southwest is carrying the torch.
Yeah. So. All right.
Moving forward. All right, we have the kind of wacky story.
Get out of our depressing funk now.
Yeah, let's get back to jail here. So this one on ZDNet, a man who hacked the jail systems to free an associate was sent behind bars, and that's a good friend. The kind of friend that when I go to jail, they come and they get me out, or they try at least, or if not, you get to be roomies then.
Yeah, I've seen in the past where like there was an inmate who tried to hack their release from inside jail, which was pretty creative. Here it was just an associate outside a friend. What I thought was really neat about this story was if you're a security researcher, it's informative, but even if you're just the average Joe, what this hacker did really didn't require sophisticated computer skills. It was mostly a social engineering attack. Over the period of, what's it, like 2 months, 2 or 3 months, he reached out to various employees, fired off emails, basically did phishing attacks and spear phishing to try and target particular employees until he finally managed to gain credentials from a single employee. And once that was done, he was able to log into the systems to try and schedule the release of his friend. Fortunately, he was caught in the meantime, went to jail, is now sentenced and serving a term. I forget exactly how long. 7 years.
Yeah.
So, maybe he gets out on parole a little early on that one, but still, he'll be in jail a while. And also has a fine of $235,488, which covers court costs, but also it covers the third-party company the jail had to bring in to figure out how somebody broke into their system. So they had a security company that actually did the full investigation on that. And it's nice to see that they were able to get that back from the attacker. But the reality is if he had been out of the country, then there'd be no penalty here, so we can make this depressing again. But, he was trying to get his friend out of jail, and instead, he ended up in jail. Maybe they'll be in the same cell block, though, so they can stay friends.
I would hope so. I would love to find out how long the original person was in jail for, because I love that when it's like, oh, he had a 3-month sentence, and
this guy gets 7 years.
He gets 7 years for that. So, but I have a feeling that either way they'll both be back. It seems like the kind of people that like to hang out together. Well, we did want to end on some good news, and here's one for those of you that are fans of the podcast here. We talked with VendorHawk a few weeks back. We talked to their CEO about basically their system that they have for helping you track all of your different SaaS subscriptions and making sure you're not overpaying and you're taking advantage of all the services that you have. Well, they were just acquired by ServiceNow. They snapped them up there, according to this GeekWire article, and that was all over the Newswire the other day. So that's great to see that the Technado bump continues.
Yeah, we need to set up some kind of like trophy board or whatever for any company that we interview that then gets acquired shortly thereafter. ServiceNow, scoop them up. And the VendorHawk, they had a really neat product. If you didn't see the interview, where they just basically helped you to keep track of all of your software as a service subscriptions, which even as an individual between Amazon Music and Netflix and Hulu, you have all these little subscriptions, and before you know it, you're paying $300 a month, and you can't remember what all these little services are, and you forget about them. So they do that for businesses.
Until you get that email that says, you've just been renewed for 3 more months. You go, I should have
meant to cancel. Yeah. And then you spend half an hour on the phone with somebody who says they're the manager.
Well, there's Patrick Lowndes in the back of that picture, the guy that we had on our show. They're out in Seattle, so good for them. Congratulations! And if you'd like to be acquired as well, then just reach out to us here at the podcast and let us know
Schedule an interview.
You'd like to be interviewed, and we'll take care of that for you. You probably should have a company and or product first, but I don't know that that's guaranteed that you need that. We'll find out. So that's going to do it for us today. Don, anything else to add before we close out here?
I had my laptop on the screen most of the time, so I didn't get a chance to search for what the Ubuntu C name was that they announced. I really wanted to look that up because it was a third-party one. I'll have to look that up and have that in the podcast next week. Or if you can find it faster than me, please tweet it to me because I can't seem to remember. But otherwise, lots of good Linux news. A little depressing on the security side, but a fun week all in all.
Well, we should also check because you talked several times about the service you use to check your
SSL Mate. Yeah.
SSL Mate.
Yeah, if I was in my work browser, I have it bookmarked. But I'm pretty
security
sure
website the easy way. sign up for SSL Mate. Seems to be the right one. So
Hey, there we go. Here, let me just show it real quick on my laptop. It is, and they're not a sponsor. We don't make any money on this. I'm just saying this is a service that I personally use. SSLmate.com, and right at the top they've got Cert Spotter. Right, Cert Spotter. They do have a paid version of it for companies that are monitoring a large amount of domains. But on a personal level, if you just have like 4 or 5 domains, you can go in there for free, and you can set it up, and it'll monitor those certificate transparency lists, and it will let you know anytime a certificate is issued. And they do up to 5 domains free. There we go. But for businesses, you can monitor for a certain amount. Really, really handy way to know whether or not your certificates are being issued in unauthorized areas, or whether somebody you've authorized in the past is still issuing certs under your name. So definitely a great thing to check out. We should reach out to SSLMate, see if they want to do an interview or something. But anyhow.
They could probably use another round of funding that would come from doing an interview with us.
And then get acquired. See?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, I'm searching for the code name here. Can't find it.
Right. We'll work it into the next podcast.
Oh, well. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And be sure to share it with your friends. Let them know about the Technado and how amazing it is. Rate us, review us, and do all those great things. But, in the meantime, thanks so much for joining us today on the Technado. And we'll see you next time.
Word.